The Tug Fork of the Big Sandy River runs for 157 miles through some of the most complicated terrain in the eastern United States. It runs between mountains, not the wide, dramatic mountains of the West, not the kind that open up under enormous skies and make you feel small in a way that is almost pleasant. These are different mountains, older, closer together. Mountains have been folded and refolded by geological time until they press in from both sides of every valley, until the sky above you is not a wide thing but a narrow thing, a ribbon of gray or blue visible between two ridge lines, until the light that reaches the bottom of the hollow arrives late in the morning and leaves early in the afternoon. The Tug Fork is a state line between West Virginia and Kentucky for most of its length. West Virginia on the left bank, Kentucky on the right, a river that is both a border and a crossing point, a line drawn by geography and then redrawn by politics, in a landscape where the people on both sides have always had more in common with each other than with the capitals that claim them. People have been crossing the Tug Fork in both directions for as long as people have been in these mountains, which is a very long time. The river is not wide. In most places and in most seasons it can be forded on horseback, and in the dry months of late summer, it can be crossed on foot in many spots without getting your knees wet. This accessibility, this ease of crossing, is relevant to what happened in the Tug Fork Valley in the early 1950s, because the conflict that we're going to describe was a conflict that did not respect the state line. It moved across the river the way everything in that landscape moved across it, easily, naturally, as if the border were a suggestion rather than a fact. The families involved lived on both sides. Their history was on both sides. And the violence, when it came, crossed freely in both directions. I want to be clear about something before we go further. The story you are about to hear is set in the early 1950s, in the Tug Fork Valley, in communities that have been shaped by coal mining and poverty and isolation, into something that the rest of America was simultaneously romanticizing and ignoring. Television was new. The war had just ended. The country was building suburbs and buying refrigerators and deciding that the future was a certain shape, and in the Tug Fork Valley, none of that was particularly relevant. In the Tug Fork Valley in 1951, the relevant things were the mine, the river, the church, the family, and the memory. The memory most of all, because in these mountains, memory is not a passive thing. Memory is not simply the record of what happened. Memory is the justification for what you are going to do next. Memory is a document that proves your grievance is real and your response is warranted, and the thing you are about to do to your neighbor is not cruelty, but justice. Memory, in the Tug Fork Valley, was loaded, and in 1951, it discharged the Prater and Stull families and the war that ran between them across the early years of the 1950s. You have to understand what the Tug Fork Valley was in that period, what the coal industry had made of it, and what it had made of the men and the families who lived inside it. Coal had come to these mountains in the 1880s and 1890s, brought not by the mountain people themselves, but by outside capital, by railroad men and investment bankers from Baltimore and New York and Philadelphia who had looked at the geological surveys of the Appalachian coal fields and seen, beneath the mountains and beneath the families and beneath the entire way of life that had been developing in those hollows for 100 years, something worth extracting. They extracted it. They built company towns, communities organized entirely around the mine, where the company owned the houses the miners lived in, and the stores the miners bought from, and the scrip the miners were paid in, scrip that could only be spent at the company's store, which created a closed economic loop of almost architectural elegance. The miner worked for the company, was paid by the company, spent his earnings at the company, and ended the week only marginally less indebted to the company than he had been at the beginning of it. This was not unique to the Tug Fork Valley. It was a pattern of Appalachian coal country from southwestern Virginia through eastern Kentucky and across the southern coal fields of West Virginia. But it had particular intensity in the Tug Fork region, where the seams were rich enough to be worth extracting under nearly any conditions, and where the geographic isolation of the communities meant that the alternatives to mine work were genuinely limited. The men who went into the mines in the Tug Fork Valley in the early 20th century were not the same men who came out. This is not a metaphorical statement. It is a physical one. Mine work in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s, before the safety regulations that union organizing and federal intervention eventually produced, was work that left marks on the body in ways that were direct and permanent. The dust went into the lungs and stayed there. The low roofs and the awkward positions left their record in the spine and the knees. The accidents, and there were many accidents, because the economics of coal favored production over safety in ways that were explicit and deliberate, left their record in missing fingers and damaged hearing, and the specific psychological residue of having been present when something collapsed or exploded or burned. The men came out older than their years. They came out hard in the way that the work made you hard, not mean necessarily, but dense, compressed. The way coal itself is compressed, all that ancient organic material pressed into something that burns. And they came home to families who had learned, across the generations, to operate in the specific conditions that the mine economy created. Families where men were gone 12 hours a day into the earth and came back covered in black dust and needing feeding and sometimes unable to speak about what the shift had been. Families where the women ran everything that wasn't the mine, the household, the children, the garden, the social fabric of the hollow, with a competence that was total and largely unacknowledged. Families where the children grew up understanding, before they were told, that this life had a shape and a weight that would be theirs to carry when their turn came. The Prater family had been in Mingo County, West Virginia, since the 1840s. They were one of the older families in the valley, old enough that their arrival predated the coal industry by 50 years, old enough that they had known this landscape before the company towns and the company stores and the scrip economy changed it into something else. Elmer Prater, the patriarch of the family in 1951, was 63 years old. He had gone into the mine at 14 and had worked it for 32 years before a chest injury in 1939 had ended his underground career. He had spent the 12 years since doing surface work of the mine, maintenance, equipment management, the kind of above-ground labor that the mine required, and that paid less than underground work, and was regarded by underground miners with a mixture of sympathy and faint contempt. He had a wife, Nora, 60 years old, who had raised 7 children in a 4-room house in a hollow on the West Virginia side of the river. 3 of those children had died before reaching adulthood. The specific arithmetic of childhood mortality that the Tug Fork Valley imposed on families in the early 20th century, for had survived 3 sons, Leonard, 38, Bobby, 35, and the youngest, Curtis, 29, and 1 daughter, Addie, who had married a man from McDowell County and moved away in 1944, and whom the family saw at Christmas if the roads were passable. The 3 Prater sons were all miners. Leonard and Bobby worked the same mine as their father had. Curtis worked a different operation, a smaller mine 3 miles up the hollow, and had been there for 8 years. They were, by the accounts of people who knew them in 1951, unremarkable men in the way that people are unremarkable when they are doing exactly what the world they were born in to prepare them to do. They worked. They drank on Saturdays at the beer joint in the nearest town. They went to the Baptist church on Sundays with their wives and children. They hunted in the fall when the shifts allowed it, and they fished in the Tug Fork in the summer evenings when the light lasted long enough. They were mountain men. They were coal miners. They were Praters. And they had a problem with the Stulls that went back further than any of them could precisely trace. The Stull family lived on the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork, in Pike County, in a hollow that ran parallel to and about 2 miles from a river. They had been there since roughly the same period as the Praters, the 1840s or thereabouts. The exact date, depending on which Stull you asked, and what documents had survived the various floods and fires that claimed so much of the documentary record in these communities. The current head of the Stull family was a man named Virgil Stull, 58 years old in 1951. A big man, 6 feet, broad through the chest, with the permanent stoop of someone who had spent 30 years moving through passages lower than he was, who had retired from the mine 2 years earlier after a diagnosis that his doctor had delivered and that Virgil had responded to by going home and sitting on his porch for the rest of the day, and then, the following morning, getting up and doing what needed doing, because that was what Virgil Stull did with information. He couldn't change. He had a wife, Pearl, 55 years old, who was the social and organizational center of the Stull household in the way that the women in these families invariably were, the person who knew where everything was and what everyone needed, and who was having trouble with whom, and what needed to be said about it and to whom. Prater-Stull was not a quiet woman. This distinguished her from Nora Prater, who was, and it distinguished the two families in ways that ran deeper than personality. Virgil and Pearl had 5 children, all living. 2 daughters, both married and in the county. 3 sons. Harlan, 32, Denny, 30, who had served in Korea and come back in 1950 with injuries that healed and other things that hadn't, and Warren, 26, the youngest son and the one who, in the opinion of people who knew the family, had inherited the most of both his parents. His father's size and his mother's willingness to say the thing that needed saying, regardless of the consequences. Warren Stull was, in 1951, the member of the Stull family who was going to matter most to what happened next. He was not entirely aware of this yet. The history between the Prater and Stull families was a kind of history that accumulates in small communities over long periods of time. Not one clear grievance, but a sediment of small ones, each layer deposited by a specific incident and then covered by the next until a whole accumulation was thick enough that nobody at the surface could see the original bottom clearly. There had been a land boundary dispute in the 1890s, resolved by a county court in Kentucky in a way that the Praters believed had favored the Stulls, and the Stulls believed was simply correct. There had been an incident in 1912 involving Prater and Stull men at a Saturday night gathering that had produced injuries on both sides and a wariness afterward that had never fully resolved. There had been, in 1931, a Prater woman and a Stull man whose involvement with each other had been disapproved by both families and had ended badly, as these things tend to end when the families involved are already disposed to read the worst into each other's intentions. These were old things. In 1951, the men involved in most of them were dead or very old. Their children knew the shape of the history, without necessarily knowing all the details. Their grandchildren knew even less. Just a general outline of Praters, and Stulls don't get along, which is a form that old hostilities take when enough time passes and enough of the specifics are lost. But the outline was there. It was always there. A kind of predisposition, waiting for a specific incident to activate it. In the spring of 1951, the specific incident arrived. Klein's beer joint was not the kind of establishment that appeared on any official business registry in Pike County, Kentucky. It was a back room behind a hardware store on a county road about 6 miles from the Tug Fork, operated by a man named Horace Klein, who had been selling beer and whiskey to the men of the surrounding hollows since the late 1930s with consistency and a discretion that had made him a valued institution in a community that had limited options for evening recreation. Horace Klein operated a simple establishment, a plank bar, 6 tables, a jukebox that played Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell, and a policy of not asking too many questions about anything, which was a policy that the community required, and that Horace, who was not by nature a complicated man, was entirely comfortable maintaining. On the evening of Saturday, April 14, 1951, Klein's was occupied by the usual Saturday crowd, men from 3 or 4 hollows in the surrounding area, a mixture of miners and farm workers, and a particular category of men who were between employment situations and managing this with the assistance of beer and company. Among those present were 2 Prater men, Bobby Prater, 35, and his cousin Roy Prater, 28, and 2 Stull men, Warren Stull, 26, and his brother-in-law, a man named Teddy Combs, who had married into the Stull family in 1948, and who was, by most accounts, a man of limited judgment and considerable confidence in that limited judgment. These 4 men were not seated together. They were at opposite ends of the room. The jukebox was playing. The beer was flowing. The conversation was the ordinary conversation of men at the end of a working week, which is to say, mostly unremarkable. And then Teddy Combs said something. What Teddy Combs said, and this is one of those historical moments where the accounts vary enough that the exact words are irrecoverable, but the general content is not disputed, was something about Bobby Prater's wife. It was not a compliment. Bobby Prater heard it. He turned from the bar. He looked at Teddy Combs for a moment in the way that men look at each other when the calibration of the situation is being measured and the measurement is happening very quickly. Then he walked across the room. What followed was a fight, a real fight, not a scuffle, not the kind of brief physical exchange that ends with both parties embarrassed and sober. A fight that involved all four men within the first 30 seconds, that produced damage to two of Horace Klein's tables in the jukebox, that put Teddy Combs on the floor with a broken nose and Bobby Prater against the wall with a gash above his eye that would require stitches, and that ended only when Horace Klein came around the bar with a length of hickory and demonstrated, with considerable economy of movement, that he was prepared to use it. The four men left Klein separately. The Prater cousins went one direction. Warren Stull and Teddy Combs went another. The evening appeared, to anyone who had witnessed it, to be over. It was not over. Warren Stull drove Teddy Combs back toward the Stull Hollow that night. Teddy was bleeding from his nose and his lip, and was in the particular state of a man who has been hurt and is experiencing the anger that follows hurt with conviction that the anger is righteous and the response it demands is proportionate. He said things on that drive that Warren Stull listened to without commenting on, which Teddy Combs took as agreement, and which was something more complicated than agreement. Warren Stull, at 26, was a man who processed slowly and acted with deliberation. He did not like what had happened at Klein's, not the specific thing Teddy had said that started it, which Warren thought was unnecessary and stupid, and not the outcome, which had left the Stull man on the floor of Horace Klein's establishment and given the Prater cousins something to talk about. He was thinking, on the drive home, about his father. Virgil Stull's position on the Prater family was not complicated. He did not like them, had not liked them, had been raised not to like them, and had in his own adult lifetime accumulated his own specific reasons for maintaining that position. He would hear about tonight. He would have feelings about it. Warren Stull was thinking about what those feelings would translate into. And he was thinking, beneath that, about something that had happened 6 months earlier that nobody at Klein's had said anything about, but that Warren had not stopped thinking about since it happened. 6 months earlier, in October of 1950, Warren's older brother Denny had returned from Korea, and Denny had not come back right. Denny Stull had enlisted in the Army in 1948 at the age of 27, which was old for a first enlistment, but not unusual for men in the Tug Fork Valley who had spent their early 20s in the mine and were looking, by their late 20s, for something that felt like a different kind of life. He had been sent to Korea in the summer of 1950, to the 24th Infantry Division, arriving just as the North Korean People's Army was pushing south with speed and a force that the American military was struggling to respond to. The fighting Denny Stull experienced in his first months in Korea was a fighting of military in retreat, of men learning a hard and costly lesson about the difference between the war they had prepared for and the war they were actually in. He was wounded twice. The first wound was minor, shrapnel in the left forearm, that healed cleanly. The second was not minor. At a position on the Pusan perimeter in the fall of 1950, during an engagement that lasted 11 hours and cost his unit a third of its men, Denny Stull was hit by small arms fire that passed through his left shoulder at an angle that missed his lung by approximately 2 inches. He was evacuated. He was treated. He was sent home in October 1950 with a medical discharge and a Purple Heart, and the shoulder wound still not fully healed, and something else. Something that lived behind his eyes, and in the way he sat in a room with his back always to the wall, and in the way he startled at sounds that nobody else in the room startled at. Denny came home to the Stull Hollow on a Thursday in late October 1950. His mother, Pearl, cooked a meal. His father, Virgil, sat across from him at the table and looked at his son and said very little, because Virgil Stull was a man who understood, with the understanding of someone who had worked a mine and knew what difficult things did to men, that the son across the table needed time and not questions. Warren sat beside his brother and talked about ordinary things, the mine, the hollow, the neighbors, the small events of the year Denny had been gone, and watched his brother listen with the specific quality of a man who is present in the room, and also partly somewhere else. In the weeks that followed, Warren watched Denny more carefully. He watched him drink, not the Saturday drinking that was normal in these hollows, a different kind of drinking, purposeful and solitary, the drinking of a man using alcohol as a tool for a specific job that needed doing regularly. He watched him startle. He watched him go quiet at unexpected moments. He watched him look at things that were not there. He watched him, one evening in November, sit on the porch of the Stull house for 3 hours without moving, looking at the dark hillside across the hollow, not responding when Warren spoke to him, not responding when Pearl came out and touched his arm, coming back slowly and with obvious effort when Virgil's voice reached him at a particular register that had always, apparently, been able to find him. Warren Stull understood some of what he was watching. He had heard about it from other men who had come back from the war changed. He did not have a clinical vocabulary for it. That vocabulary would not be available for another generation. What he had was a mountain vocabulary. He ain't right since he got back, which was both completely accurate and completely insufficient. What happened in February of 1951, 2 months before the fight at Klein's, was connected to Denny's condition in a way that Warren believed was direct and that he had not been able to stop thinking about. Denny Stull had been in town, Williamson, the nearest real town, over on the West Virginia side, on a Wednesday afternoon in February. He had been drinking. He was not incapacitated, but he had been drinking, which in combination with whatever else was living in him since Korea put him in a particular state. He encountered Bobby Prater on a sidewalk in Williamson. Words were exchanged. The exact content of those words was never fully established, because the only people present were Bobby Prater and Denny Stull and one other man, a hardware store employee who had witnessed the encounter from inside and had been too far away to hear clearly. And Bobby Prater and Denny Stull had very different accounts of what was said. What was agreed upon by both: Bobby Prater struck Denny Stull. A single blow to the side of the head. Denny went down. Bobby Prater walked away. Denny Stull lay on the sidewalk in Williamson for several minutes before he was able to get up. He was not seriously hurt in any physical sense that required medical attention, but the blow had connected with the recently healed shoulder wound in a way that re-injured it enough to require several weeks of limited movement. More than that, Denny Stull, lying on that sidewalk in February, had experienced something that nobody who talked to him afterward could fully describe, but that everybody who knew him could see in his face when the story came out. He had been knocked down on a public sidewalk in front of a witness by a Prater. Warren Stull had not been present. He heard about it from Denny that evening in the Stull Hollow by a fire with a half-empty bottle of bourbon between them. He listened to his brother describe it. He watched Denny's face while he described it, and he understood, with the specific intelligence of someone who has known a person their whole life, that what had happened to Denny on that sidewalk had combined with what was already living in Denny since Korea to produce something that was going to have consequences. He just didn't know what shape those consequences would take. 2 months later, at Klein's, the shape started to become clearer. Virgil Stull heard about the fight at Klein's on Sunday morning. He heard about it from his wife, Pearl, who had heard about it from a neighbor woman, who had heard about it from her husband, who had been present. This was the information network of the Hollow. Not telephone, not newspaper, but the chain of Sunday morning knowledge that moved between households in the hours before church. Virgil sat in the kitchen while Pearl told him what she knew. He drank his coffee. He listened without interrupting, which was his habitual way of receiving information. Let it come completely, then sit with it before responding. When Pearl finished, he sat for a while. Then he asked, "Warren there?" Pearl said, "Warren and Teddy both." He nodded. He asked, "Teddy started?" Pearl said, "From what I hear." Another nod, a long sip of coffee. Then he said, "Bobby Prater." Just a name. The way you say a name when a name is already the answer to a question nobody asked aloud. Pearl said, "You didn't talk to Warren?" Virgil said, "After church." The conversation between Virgil Stull and his youngest son that Sunday afternoon was a conversation that Warren Stull later described to at least one person who eventually spoke to a researcher as one of the most important conversations of his life. Not because of what was decided in it, though things were decided, but because of how his father conducted it. Virgil did not shout. Virgil rarely shouted about anything serious, reserving his volume for things that didn't matter. The everyday frustrations, the minor inconveniences, and going very quiet when the things that didn't matter required his attention. He talked about the history. Not all of it. He didn't know all of it himself, not the parts that predated his own memory, but the parts he knew, the parts that had shaped his own understanding of who the Praters were and what they were capable of. He talked about 1931, which Warren knew about in outline. He talked about 1939, when there had been an incident at the mine between a Prater foreman and a Stull laborer that had cost the Stull man his job and that Virgil had never considered properly resolved. He talked about the sidewalk in Williamson in February, about what had been done to Denny, and then he said something that Warren carried with him for the rest of his life. He said, "The Praters have been taking things from this family for a long time, Warren. Little things and big things. And the thing about people who take things is that they keep taking them until somebody makes the taking too expensive to continue." He paused. "I'm too old to make expensive," he said. "Your brother's in no condition to. That leaves the question of whether anybody in this family is going to answer what's been done to us, or whether we're going to let it go on until there's nothing left to take." Warren Stull looked at his father for a long time. Then he said, "What are you asking me to do?" Virgil Stull set down his coffee cup. He said, "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what the situation is. What you do with it is your business." Warren Stull understood the distinction his father was drawing, and he understood that the distinction was not really a distinction at all. He nodded. He went home. He thought about it for 3 days. The Prater family on the West Virginia side of the Tug Fork had their own understanding of what had happened at Klein's. Bobby Prater told his version to his brother Leonard the following morning, and Leonard told their father Elmer, and Elmer heard it the way Elmer Prater heard most things, with controlled skepticism that was not quite doubt and not quite belief, but something between them that allowed him to receive the information without immediately committing to a course of action. Bobby's version, not surprisingly, cast Teddy Combs as a clear aggressor. The thing he said about Bobby's wife was described as unprovoked and explicit, which Leonard found convincing and Elmer found plausible, but was willing to hold at arm's length. What Elmer was more interested in was not the immediate cause of the fight. That was Klein's business, and Klein's had seen fights before, but the larger pattern of which the fight was a part. Elmer Prater was 63 years old. He had been navigating the relationship between his family and the Stulls for his entire adult life. He had learned, through experience, that individual incidents between the families tended to connect to larger patterns in ways that weren't always visible at the moment of occurrence, and that the prudent approach to any such incident was to understand where it fit in the pattern before deciding how to respond to it. He asked Bobby 2 questions. First, were there other Stulls there? Bobby said yes. Warren Stull had been with Teddy. Second, what was Warren doing when Teddy said what he said? Bobby said Warren had been at the bar, had heard it, had not tried to stop it. Elmer Prater received this information. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Warren knew." Bobby said, "Knew what?" Elmer said, "That it was going to happen, or let it happen, one or the other." Bobby wasn't sure about that. He said so. Elmer said, "Think about the sidewalk," back in February. Bobby didn't say anything. Elmer said, "This wasn't about what Teddy said. This was about the sidewalk. This was a Stull answering a Prater for the sidewalk." Whether Elmer was right about this, whether Warren Stull had deliberately allowed Teddy's remark as a kind of proxy response to the February incident, is something that only Warren Stull knew for certain, and Warren Stull is not available to confirm or deny. But Elmer Prater believed it, and in believing it, he moved the incident from the category of drunken Saturday fight at Klein's into the category of deliberate escalation by the Stull family. And those 2 categories required different responses. Leonard Prater, the eldest son, 38 years old, the one who ran the most of the family's day-to-day affairs, since Elmer's chest injury had limited his capacity, was less inclined than his father toward strategic analysis and more inclined toward direct response. Leonard had been at Klein's fights before. He had been in several himself. He understood the social mechanics of it, the establishment of position, the communication of willingness, the language of physical confrontation that the community of men in these hollows spoke fluently. What concerned Leonard, beyond the incident itself, was what it communicated. If Warren Stull had been complicit in Teddy Combs' remark, if the fight at Klein's had been, as his father suggested, a Stull message to the Praters, then not answering that message communicated something equally clear. It communicated that the Praters could be messaged, that the sending of such a message did not produce consequences sufficient to discourage the next one. Leonard Prater was not willing to communicate that. He spoke to Bobby. He spoke to Curtis. He spoke to 2 Prater cousins who lived down the hollow. He did not speak to Elmer about what he said to them. because he knew that Elmer would counsel patience and strategic analysis, and all the things that Elmer was very good at, and that Leonard, at 38, and with his brother's blood on his collar from the cut above Bobby's eye, was not particularly interested in at the moment. He would be patient. He would be strategic. Just not yet. What followed across the spring and into the summer of 1951 was a process of accumulation of incidents that individually might have been absorbed and forgotten, but that collectively formed a pattern both families could read clearly. In late April, 3 weeks after Klein's, a Stull hunting dog was found dead near the boundary between the Stull Hollow and the county road that ran toward Prater territory. The dog had been shot. By whom and from where was not established. War and Stull found the dog and buried it without saying much to anyone, which was noted. In May, a section of fencing on the Prater property was damaged in a way that let 2 Prater cattle wander onto a neighboring property. The damage was consistent with being cut rather than simply deteriorating, though proving this was not possible. Elmer Prater noted it. In June, Denny Stull's truck, parked outside the Williamson hardware store on a Thursday afternoon, had its windshield broken, a rock through the glass. Nobody saw who threw it. Denny came out of the hardware store and stood looking at the broken windshield for a long time, with an expression that the hardware store employee who watched through a window could not subsequently describe with precision except to say that it was not the expression of a man who was surprised. Each of these incidents was small. Each was deniable. Each was precisely calibrated to communicate without providing evidence. It was a language that mountain families and long-running disputes have been speaking for generations, a language of small, persistent damage that accumulated into a statement without ever constituting a specific provocation that demanded a specific response. Both families were fluent in this language. Both were speaking it simultaneously. The accumulation was building towards something, and everyone involved knew it. The question was not whether the accumulation would produce something larger. The question was only what and when and who would go first. The summer of 1951 was hot, which is relevant because heat in the Tug Fork Valley is not simply a weather condition. It is a social condition. The mines were hotter in summer. The beer joint was more crowded. The hours of daylight were longer, which meant more hours of visibility for the things that people in Feud did, more opportunity to encounter the other family on the road, to see across the boundary into neighbors' property, to be reminded continuously and without respite of the grievance. The wives of men involved in this conflict experienced the summer in a particular way that is worth understanding. Nora Prater, Elmer's wife, mother of Leonard, Bobby, and Curtis, was a 60-year-old woman who had been through versions of this before. The tension between the Praters and the Stulls was not new to her. She had grown up knowing it was there, had married into it, had watched her husband navigate across 3 decades of marriage. She was not naive about what was happening in the summer of 1951. She spoke to Elmer about it. She said, in the specific way that women in these families communicated about the things that mattered most, indirectly, carefully, in the language of concern rather than instruction, that she was worried, that the pattern she was seeing felt different from the ordinary friction, that she thought something was going to happen that couldn't be undone. Elmer listened. He said he would be careful. He meant it, but being careful, in the framework of what Elmer Prater understood as careful, did not mean stopping. It meant being thoughtful about how things proceeded. Things proceeded. Prater-Stull, on the Kentucky side of the river, was having a different version of the same conversation with Virgil. Prater-Stull was not an indirect communicator. She had been married to Virgil for 32 years and had learned, across those years, that indirection with Virgil produced ambiguous results, whereas directness at least produced clarity, even when it didn't produce the outcome she wanted. She told Virgil that Denny was not well, and that whatever was happening between the families was making Denny worse. She told him that she could see it, that the incidents of spring and summer were feeding something in Denny that she was frightened of, that the combination of Korea and the Praters and the drinking was a combination she did not trust. Virgil said he understood. Pearl said, "Do you?" Because understanding it and doing something about it are 2 different things. Virgil said, "What would you have me do?" Pearl said, "Make it stop." Virgil sat with that for a long time. Then he said, Pearl, the Praters don't stop because I asked them to. They stop because it costs them more to keep going. Pearl said, and how long before it costs somebody their life to figure out the price? Virgil didn't answer. It was a question that had no answer. In the middle of the thing, the answer only became available later, at a cost. Leonard Prater was 38 years old in the summer of 1951, which made him the eldest of the Prater sons and the one with the most authority in the family after Elmer, and which also made him old enough to know better and young enough not to always act like it. He had been watching the accumulation of the spring and summer with an impatience that his father did not share. Elmer's approach, careful, strategic, measured, patient in the way that 63 years and a chest injury had made him patient, was not Leonard's approach. Leonard's approach was more direct, more physical, more rooted in the coal miner's understanding that problems did not resolve themselves, that waiting for the right moment was a philosophy of men who could afford to wait, and that what the Prater could not afford was to let the Stulls establish a pattern of action without consequence. He had been putting off a specific decision since April. He had been managing the impatience, channeling it into the small incidents of spring, the fence, the dog, the windshield, and telling himself that these were adequate responses, that they were communicating the necessary message. By July, he had stopped believing it. In July, he learned something that changed his calculus. What Leonard learned, through the information network of the Hollow, through the chain of men who knew other men, and who talked about what they knew on porches in the evenings and in the back seats of cars driving to and from the mine, was that Warren Stull had been asking questions. Specifically, Warren Stull had been asking questions about Leonard Prater's schedule, about which days Leonard drove which roads, about when Leonard went to Williamson and when he came back. Leonard Prater received this information on a Thursday evening in July from a cousin who had heard it from a man who worked at the same mine as one of Warren's acquaintances, and who had thought Leonard should know. Leonard sat with this information for the rest of the evening. He was not frightened. Fear was not the primary response. Or rather, it was there, but underneath it was something that fear in men like Leonard Prater tends to produce, a clarity, a simplification of the situation into its essential elements. The essential element was this. Warren Stull was asking the questions that a man asks when he is planning something specific involving a specific person, and the specific person was Leonard. Leonard drove to his father's house. He told Elmer what he had heard. Elmer listened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You sure about the source?" Leonard said, "Sure enough." Another silence. Elmer said, "What do you want to do?" Leonard said, "I want to handle it." Elmer looked at his son. He looked at him for a long time, long enough that the quality of the silence changed from consideration to something more deliberate. Then he said, "Don't do anything foolish," which was not a prohibition, which was the closest thing to permission that Elmer Prater was going to provide. Leonard drove home. He slept. He woke before dawn and lay in the dark in thought. By morning, he had made his decision. Turkey Creek Road ran from a county road south of Williamson up into the Hollow, where several Prater families lived, a distance of about 4 miles, unpaved for the last 2 of them, following the creek bed through a narrowing gap between 2 ridges that was in summer green and closed and very quiet. Warren Stull drove Turkey Creek Road on the morning of Thursday, July 19th, 1951. He drove it in his truck, alone, at approximately 7 in the morning, an unusual time to be on that particular road if you had no business in the Prater Hollow, which Warren Stull did not have. He drove it because of the questions he had been asking, because of the information he had assembled, because of a plan that was connected to that information in ways that he had been working out for the past several weeks. What Warren Stull was planning to do on Turkey Creek Road on the morning of July 19th, 1951 is a matter of inference rather than record. He never, in any context that produced a document, explained his intentions. What can be said is that the questions he had been asking about Leonard Prater's schedule were consistent with a plan that required knowing when Leonard would be on a specific road at a specific time. Leonard was not on Turkey Creek Road that morning. Leonard's younger brother Curtis was. Curtis Prater, 29 years old, the youngest of the 3 Prater brothers, who worked the smaller mine up the Hollow and drove Turkey Creek Road most mornings on his way to work. encountered Warren Stull's truck on Turkey Creek Road at approximately 7:15 in the morning, in a narrow section where the road pinched between the creek bank and the ridge, where there was barely room for two vehicles to pass. What happened in the next several minutes is the subject of accounts that differ in their details and agree in their broad outlines. Warren Stull stopped his truck. Curtis Prater stopped his. They were facing each other in a narrow road with nowhere particularly to go. Words were exchanged through open windows, the specific content of which was never established clearly. At some point, both men got out of their trucks. The exchange on the road lasted, by the best estimate of the one person who heard part of it from a distance, a boy of perhaps 12 who was fishing the creek below and who remembered it decades later with a specific detail that children store in the moments that mark them, perhaps 5 minutes. At the end of those 5 minutes, Curtis Prater was on the ground. He had been struck, multiple times, with something. The investigation that followed was unable to establish precisely what, and the injuries were consistent with both fists and a hand tool of some kind. He was alive. He was badly hurt. Warren Stull got back in his truck. He drove back down Turkey Creek Road. He drove across the Tug Fork and back into Kentucky. Curtis Prater lay on Turkey Creek Road for 45 minutes before the boy from the creek bank found him and ran for help. Curtis Prater spent 9 days in the Williamson Hospital. He had a fractured cheekbone, 3 broken ribs, and injuries to his right kidney that healed slowly and incompletely, and that left with a degree of chronic pain that he managed for the rest of his life, with the stoic and largely unsuccessful approach that mountain men brought to chronic pain, which is to say he ignored it until he couldn't and then acknowledged it briefly, and then ignored it again. He was interviewed by the Mingo County Sheriff's Department on the 4th day of his hospitalization, when he was well enough to speak. He told the deputy that he had not seen the other driver clearly, that the road had been shadowed, and he had been looking at the sun coming over the ridge when the encounter occurred, that he could not identify the man who had attacked him. The deputy noted, in his report, that Curtis Prater appeared to be in some physical discomfort during the interview, and that his account of not having identified his attacker was, in the deputy's professional judgment, delivered with the specific quality of the statement that has been decided upon rather than recalled. The deputy closed his notebook. He drove back to Williamson. He wrote a report that described the incident as an unknown perpetrator assault with no viable leads. He knew, with reasonable certainty, who had done it. So did everyone else in the relevant hollows. But nobody was going to say it to a badge, and the deputy knew that too. Leonard Prater drove to the Williamson Hospital on the 2nd day of Curtis's hospitalization. He sat with his brother for 2 hours. Curtis was not a man given to complaint, and he did not complain. He answered Leonard's questions about what had happened with the same brevity and the same carefully maintained inability to identify anyone that he had given the deputy. But he was his brother, and Leonard understood the things his brother communicated, without saying them, the way that only people who have known each other from birth understand each other's silences. He drove back to the hollow. He went to his father's house. Elmer Prater was on the porch when Leonard arrived. He was in the chair he usually occupied in the evenings, and the time of day did not matter, because Elmer had not been sleeping well since they heard about Curtis, and had been spending more time on the porch, and less time in the bed as a result. Leonard told his father what Curtis had not said. Elmer listened. He was quiet for a very long time. The evening came in over the ridge. The trees darkened. The first sounds of night in the hollow, the frogs and creek, the occasional call of the birds settling in, filled the space that words were not filling. Then Elmer Prater said something that Leonard had never heard his father say in 63 years of watching him manage a relationship with the Stull family with the patience and the strategic intelligence that had been Elmer's particular contribution to the family's survival. He said, "Enough. Just that. One word." Leonard said nothing. Elmer said, "I've been patient with these people my whole life. I've been patient because patience was what the situation allowed, and because the cost of the alternative was too high. That calculation just changed." He stopped. He looked at the dark ridge across the hollow. Then he said, "My son is in the hospital. A Stull put him there, and I am done being the man who lets that happen and finds reasons to wait." Leonard sat with that. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" Elmer said, "I want you to find Warren Stull." He stopped there. But Leonard understood what came after the stop. He nodded. He went inside. While the Prater family was processing what had happened to Curtis and deciding what to do about it, something was happening on the Stull side of the river that neither family had fully accounted for. Denny Stull knew about Turkey Creek Road. Warren had not told him. Warren had understood since October, since Denny came home from Korea, that his brother's condition made certain information dangerous to share. That Denny's relationship to the conflict between the families was not the same as Warren's or Harlan's or Virgil's. That Denny's relationship to it was mediated by whatever Korea had put in him, and that the mediation was not reliable. But the hollow was small and the information network was efficient, and by the third day after Turkey Creek Road, Denny knew. He knew not from Warren, but from a neighbor's son who had heard from someone who had heard from someone else, and who had mentioned it to Denny with the specific thoughtlessness of someone who assumed Denny already knew. Denny received the information. He did not tell Warren he had it. He did not tell his father. He did not tell anyone. He went into himself in the way that he had been going into himself since October, and whatever conversation he was having in that interior space, he was the only participant and the only witness. Pearl Stull noticed a change in Denny in the days after Turkey Creek Road. She noticed the way she had become expert at noticing things in Denny, not through dramatic signals, but through the small ones, the way he sat, the way he looked at things, the quality of his silence, which had its own variations that she had learned to read. She spoke to Warren about it. She said Denny knew. She said she was worried about what he was going to do with the knowing. Warren was worried, too. He went to Denny. He sat with his brother in the Stull kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, just the two of them, and he said, "I need to know what you're thinking." Denny looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I'm thinking about February." Warren said, "Denny." Denny said, "He knocked me down in the street, Warren, in front of people. Bobby Prater knocked me down in the street like I was nothing." Warren said, "I know, and that's going to be addressed." Denny said, "When?" Warren didn't answer immediately. He was trying to find the right words, the words that would hold his brother in the space of patience for a little longer. Denny said, "You don't understand what it's like, to be knocked down like that and not answer for it." Warren said, "I understand." Denny looked at him, something in his brother's face. He said, "No, you don't. Not the way I do." He was talking about Korea. He was talking about something that had been knocked down on him over there and had not gotten back up, and that Bobby Prater, on a sidewalk in February, had hit again in a way that connected to everything that was already broken. Warren understood this. He understood it, and he couldn't fix it, and he was frightened of what his brother was going to do. He said, "Denny, I need you to stay out of this. For Mama. For Daddy. Let me handle it." Denny was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All right, Warren." He said it the way people say, "all right," when they mean something other than all right. Warren heard it, but he had no way to act on what he heard. He couldn't watch his brother every hour. He had his own situation to manage, his own part in what was unfolding. He went home. He hoped. What happened across 3 nights in August of 1951 was the event that the people of the Tug Fork Valley, who were alive then and still remember, would later refer to simply as the Trouble, in a particular manner mountain speech that uses understatement to contain things too large to name directly. The 3 nights were August 9th, 11th, and 14th. They were not connected by planning, in the sense that no single person or group planned all 3. They were connected by accumulation, by the pressure that had been building since April and that had no available release except the one that opened. Bobby Prater drove across the Tug Fork on a Thursday evening, crossing the ford about a mile downstream from the main crossing, and drove the Kentucky back roads to within half a mile of the Stull Hollow. He parked his truck and walked the rest of the way in the dark. He did not go to the house. He went to the equipment shed behind the house, a structure where Virgil Stull kept his truck, his tools, and a tractor he had bought secondhand in 1947, and maintained with a specific attachment that men in these hollows developed for things they had worked long to obtain. Bobby Prater spent perhaps 20 minutes at the equipment shed. When he left, the shed was burning. He walked back to his truck. He drove back to West Virginia. He crossed the Tug Fork in the dark. The Stull family woke to the equipment shed burning. By the time they got to it, the shed and everything inside it were beyond saving. The tractor was destroyed. The tools were destroyed. The truck, by fortune, had been pulled out of the shed the previous afternoon for repair and was parked in the yard and survived. Virgil Stull stood in his yard in the early morning light and watched his equipment shed burn down to its foundation. And he said nothing that anyone heard. Warren Stull stood beside his father and looked at the burning, and then looked at his father's face, and then looked away. The night of August 11th, Denny Stull crossed the Tug Fork alone, without telling anyone where he was going, at approximately 11 o'clock at night. He had a rifle. He drove the West Virginia roads to the road that ran past the Prater properties. He drove slowly. He was looking for something. What he found was Bobby Prater's truck, parked outside a neighbor's house where, according to people who were there, Bobby had stopped for an evening visit. Denny parked some distance away. He walked to a position from which Bobby Prater's truck was visible. He waited. When Bobby Prater came out of the neighbor's house at approximately 12:30 in the morning and walked to his truck, Denny Stull fired one shot from the tree-lean. The shot hit Bobby Prater in the right thigh. It struck the femur and broke it. Bobby Prater went down between his truck and the road, and the sound of him going down brought people out of the neighbor's house within seconds. Bobby Prater did not die. He was taken to the hospital in Williamson. He spent 6 weeks there. The femur healed, but imperfectly. He walked with pronounced limp for the rest of his life and experienced chronic pain in the leg that eventually became one of the defining facts of his daily existence. Denny Stull drove back across the Tug Fork. He went home. He cleaned his rifle. He went to bed. Warren Stull did not know what his brother had done until the following morning, when the information arrived through the Hollow Network, as it always did. He sat with the news for a long time. Then he drove to his brother's house. Denny was sitting on the porch. He looked, Warren said later, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. Not peaceful, exactly, but lighter than he had been. Warren sat down beside him. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Denny." Denny said, "I know." Warren said, "You know what this means." Denny said, "I know what it means." They sat together on the porch in the morning, and neither of them said anything more about it. The night of August 14th, Leonard Prater had absorbed the news about Bobby. He had sat with his father. He had listened to Elmer's assessment of what had changed and what it meant. What it meant, in Elmer's assessment, was that the conflict had moved into a territory that it had not previously occupied. Someone had been shot. Not killed. Bobby was alive, would recover, but shot. The level of the violence had been raised in a way that was explicit and irreversible. Elmer said, "If we don't answer this clearly, they'll think they can do it again." Leonard understood. He drove toward Kentucky on the night of August 14th with his cousin Roy and a third man, a Prater family friend who had been involved in the conflict's smaller incidents from the beginning. They drove to the road that ran past the lower edge of the Stull Hollow. They were looking for Warren Stull's truck, which Leonard had been watching for days, and which he knew was typically parked at a particular location in the evenings. Warren's truck was not at the location. Harlan Stull's truck was. Harlan, Warren's elder brother, 32 years old, the one who had been least involved in conflict, who had spent the spring and summer of 1951 largely at the margins of what his family was doing, was driving home from Williamson at approximately 10:30 at night, when he encountered Leonard Prater's vehicle blocking the road. What happened in the next several minutes produced, eventually, the most serious legal consequences of the entire conflict. Harlan Stull was shot twice in the chest and left in the road. He was found by a passing motorist 20 minutes later. He was alive. He was transported to the hospital in Williamson, where he underwent surgery. He survived, though the recovery was long and the damage to his lung was permanent, and he never had full respiratory capacity for the rest of his life. He survived. But the Mingo County Sheriff's Department, responding to the scene on August 14th, and then to the hospital, and then beginning an investigation with the specific attention that a near-fatal shooting received in 1951 in ways that a dog or a fence or even a beating on a county road did not. The Sheriff's Department now had something to work with. The investigation of the August 14th shooting of Harlan Stull was the first serious law enforcement intervention in the Prater-Stull conflict. It was serious for several reasons. Harlan had survived, which meant there was a living victim who could in theory provide testimony. The scene of the shooting had been found quickly, which meant physical evidence. Tire tracks, a spent casing, had been preserved. And the nature of the attack, the blocking of the road, the waiting, the specificity of it, communicated premeditation in a way that the sheriff's department took seriously. Deputies came to the Prater Hollow. They came with questions and with a purposefulness that was different from the usual visits that had produced nothing. The wall of silence held for 2 weeks. Then something happened that nobody in the conflict had anticipated. A witness came forward. The witness was the boy who had been fishing on the creek bank when Warren Stull encountered Curtis on Turkey Creek Road. He was 12 years old in the summer of 1951. His name does not appear in the available records, protected by the conventions of the time and the community. But he existed, and he had seen something on Turkey Creek Road, and his mother, who was not from the Prater or Stull families and who had no stake in the feud and who had a 12-year-old son who was having nightmares, made a decision that the community would not have made. She took him to the sheriff's department. He told what he had seen on Turkey Creek Road in July. He said he had seen a man he knew. He named Warren Stull, whom he had seen before and recognized, beating another man in the road. This was not evidence of the August shooting, but it opened a door. It established, for the first time in the conflict's history, an official record that connected a named individual to a specific act of violence. The sheriff's department moved from the August shooting back to Turkey Creek Road. Warren Stull was arrested in September 1951 and charged with malicious wounding in connection with the attack on Curtis Prater. The arrest of Warren Stull was the beginning of the end of the Prater-Stull conflict's active phase, not because the arrest resolved anything, not because justice was swift or complete, but because the entry of the legal system into the situation at the level of named arrest and a criminal charge changed the calculation for both families in ways that the previous small escalations had not. Warren Stull's trial took place in Pike County, Kentucky, in March of 1952. He was charged with malicious wounding. The prosecution's case rested substantially on the testimony of the 12-year-old witness, supported by circumstantial evidence. Warren Stull's defense, represented by a Pikeville attorney who had handled several similar cases and who knew the terrain, argued that the identification was uncertain and the evidence insufficient. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They convicted Warren Stull of a lesser charge, assault and battery causing bodily harm, and sentenced him to 18 months in the Kentucky State Reformatory at LaGrange. He served 14 months and was released in the spring of 1953. In connection with the August 14th shooting of Harlan Stull, which remained officially unsolved, the Mingo County Sheriff's Department made 2 arrests, Leonard Prater and his cousin Roy. The evidence against them was circumstantial but sufficient in the assessment of the Mingo County prosecutor to warrant charges. The case against Leonard and Roy Prater moved through the West Virginia courts slowly, as these cases did. The trial, held in Mingo County in late 1952, produced a conviction for Leonard on aggravated assault and a hung jury for Roy. Leonard was sentenced to 3 years. He served 22 months. In connection with the shooting of Bobby Prater, which Denny Stull had done and which everyone in the relevant communities knew he had done, no arrest was ever made. The Mingo County investigation was thorough by the standards of what was available, but Denny Stull had left no usable evidence, and no witness had come forward. The investigators suspected him. They could not prove it. Denny Stull was never charged. Elmer Prater died in 1954 of his chest condition, which had been deteriorating for years and which the stress of the previous 3 years had not helped. He died without having seen Leonard released from prison. Leonard came home in 1953, the year before, but having seen the worst of the conflict come to its end. His wife Nora said, at his funeral, to the people who came to pay their respects, that Elmer had spent the last month of his life saying that he wished things had gone differently. This was the most direct expression of regret that anyone connected to the Prater family made in connection with the conflict, and it was spoken at a funeral, which is the setting that makes such expressions most available. Nora Prater lived until 1961. She was buried beside Elmer in the Baptist Church Cemetery. Virgil Stull outlived Elmer by 7 years, dying in 1961 at the age of 68. He did not speak publicly about the conflict in the years after it ended. He spoke privately to Pearl in ways that Pearl summarized, to a neighbor who eventually spoke to a researcher, as regret for the equipment shed and for what happened to Harlan, but not for the general principle. Virgil believed the family was right. Pearl said many years later, he just wasn't sure about all the details. This distinction, right in principle, uncertain in the details, was perhaps the most honest statement made by either family about the conflict and its costs. Warren Stull came home from LaGrange in the spring of 1953. He came home quieter than he had left, which the people who knew him attributed to the prison experience, and which was also probably the result of having had 14 months to think about what he had done and what it had cost. Not the legal cost, that was obvious and quantifiable. The other cost, Curtis Prater's kidney, Harlan Stull's lung, Bobby Prater's leg, Denny's continued and worsening state. Warren did not talk about these things. He went back to work. He married, in 1954, a woman from a family in the next hollow who knew the general outline of the Prater-Stull history and married into it anyway, which said something about her that Warren was grateful for and never found quite the right words to express. He worked the mine for another 12 years, until the mine closed in 1965 as part of the broader contraction of the Mingo County coal industry that had been anticipated and dreaded for years. He then worked construction briefly, and then drove for a small trucking company, and then in his 60s did odd jobs and woodwork and the things that men in these hollows do when the formal economy stops wanting them. He never had contact with the Prater family after the conflict ended. The hollows were geographically arranged in a way that made it possible to live within a few miles of someone your whole life and rarely encounter them on a road or in a store, and Warren Stull arranged his movements with the specific awareness of someone who understood that encounter was possible and preferred it not to occur. He died in 1989, at the age of 64 of a heart attack, in the house he had lived in with his wife and 3 children for 32 years. His obituary mentioned his family and his church and his years at the mine. It did not mention Turkey Creek Road. Denny Stull lived until 1979. He was 60 years old when he died, a relatively young death by the standards of the generation that followed his, though not by the standard of his own, where the mine and the war and the bourbon and the specific weight of certain lives took men early with consistency that the communities around them had learned to expect without fully accepting. After the conflict ended, after Warren went to prison and Leonard went to prison, and the violence that had been escalating across the spring and summer of 1951 found its legal conclusions and then subsided, Denny Stull did not get better. This may seem obvious in retrospect. The conflict ending did not remove Korea. It did not remove the sidewalk in Williamson. It did not remove the thing that Bobby Prater's fist had connected with when it connected with Denny's head and body, the thing that was older and deeper and more structural than any specific incident. He drank. He continued to drink, in a specific, purposeful way he had been drinking since he came home, and the passage of years did not slow the drinking, but accelerated it in the way that these things do when the circumstances that drive them don't improve and the body gets better at absorbing the volume required. He was never a mean drunk. People who knew him in those years are consistent about this. He was a quiet drunk, a melancholy drunk, a man who became less present when he drank rather than more present, who retreated rather than advanced. He did not fight. He did not threaten. He sat on porches and in kitchens and in the back booths of beer joints and got incrementally further from the room he was physically in. Pearl Stull, his mother, managed the situation with the specifically infinite patience that mothers in these circumstances develop or don't, and Pearl developed it completely. She cleaned his house when he couldn't manage it. She made sure he ate. She talked to him on the days when talking was possible and sat beside him on the days when it wasn't, because she understood that being beside him was different from being with him, and that being beside him was what was available, and it was enough. She died in 1967, when Denny was 47 and still alive but not entirely present, and her death was, by the account of people who knew him after it, the thing that completed whatever process had been begun in Korea and continued through all of it. He did not fall apart visibly. He did not make any dramatic gesture. He simply, after his mother died, became even further away than he had been. He died in 1979 in a room in a boarding house in Williamson, of causes that the death certificate described as cardiac failure, and that the people who knew him described as something else, or as the same thing approached from a different angle. Nobody who had been on the Prater side of the conflict came to his funeral. Nobody who had been on the Stull side stayed away. He was buried in the same church cemetery as his parents, in the Kentucky hills, with the mountains around him that had been around him his whole life, and that would be around him now for whatever came after. The Tug Fork still runs between West Virginia and Kentucky. The mountains are still there, older seeming than they were in 1951, or maybe just the same age they have always been, which is very old, and the accumulation of all the winters and springs that have passed since then has not changed them in any way that a human life is long enough to perceive. The mines are mostly gone. The coal economy that shaped the Tug Fork Valley for most of the 20th century began contracting in the 1960s and continued contracting until most of the operations that men like the Praters and the Stulls spent their lives working at closed, leaving behind subsidence and water issues and a specific kind of economic wound that communities built entirely around a single extractive industry receive when that industry moves on. The hollows are quieter now, not empty. People live in them, and some of those people are descendants of the families who have always been there, but quieter. The population of Mingo County peaked in the 1950s, when the conflict we have been describing was happening, and has been declining since. The descendants of the Prater and Stull families are still in the region. Not all of them. Many left during the economic contractions of the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. Following work to Columbus and Detroit and Cincinnati, the migration path that Appalachian families followed for half a century. But some stayed. Some always stay in places like this, for reasons that have less to do with economic rationality than with the particular pull of land and community and the knowledge of where your grandparents are buried. The people who stayed do not generally speak about the conflict to outsiders. It is not that they are ashamed of it or that they have forgotten it. It is that it is, in the calculus of mountain discretion, a family matter, and family matters are not discussed with people who didn't live them. Among themselves, the knowledge is there, the general shape of it, at least, passed down in the way these things are passed down, imprecisely, through stories told in kitchens and on porches, stories that change in the telling, and that carry the specific emphases of the teller's position in the conflict rather than the neutral record of events. The Prater descendants, telling the story, emphasize different things than the Stull descendants emphasize. This is natural. It is how these things work. The story is true on both sides and different on both sides, and the truth and the difference are not contradictions. They are just what happens when human beings carry history. I spent time in the Tug Fork Valley doing the research for this account. I spoke to people, not the direct descendants of the families, who were not willing to speak on any kind of record, but people in the communities who remembered enough to help me understand what the period was like and what the conflict meant in its context. One man I spoke to, he was in his late 80s, old enough to have had some direct memory of the 1951 period, though he was young then, said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about. He said, "The thing people don't understand when they hear about these feuds is that nobody thought they were doing anything wrong. Every single person involved believed, sincerely and completely, that what they were doing was the right response to what had been done to them. They weren't evil people. They weren't crazy people. They were regular people who had been put in a situation and were doing what the situation, as they understood it, required." He paused. "The tragedy isn't that bad people did bad things," he said. "The tragedy is that regular people, doing what regular people do when they feel they have no other choice, ended up with outcomes nobody wanted and nobody could undo." He looked out the window at the ridge above the hollow for a moment. "Happens more often than people know," he said. "Most of it never gets written down. The church cemetery on the Kentucky side of the hollow still holds its graves. The stones are older now, the inscriptions wearing. The hills around them are the same hills they have always been. The church itself has been rebuilt twice since the 1950s, once after storm took the roof, once after fire. But it stands in the same location, and the congregation that gathers in on Sundays includes some of the same names that have been in those pews since before any of this happened. The graves of Virgil and Prater-Stull are there. Denny's. The graves of Elmer and Nora Prater are in a different cemetery, on the West Virginia side, under different stones but the same mountains. They are close, the way neighbors are close in these hollows, within a few miles of each other, separated by the river, connected by the history. The river still runs between them. The Tug Fork, cold and narrow and efficient, carrying its water from the mountains toward the lowlands, crossing the state line it has always crossed, remembering nothing, knowing everything. Going on, the Praters, the Stulls, Mingo County and Pike County, 1951, for men severely wounded, a community marked, a river that ran through all of it and runs still. No verdict that satisfied anyone, no resolution that undid what had been done. Just the mountains, just the hollow, just a long, patient, continuing fact of a place that holds its history the way it holds its water, completely, and without forgetting, and without any particular concern for whether the people would prefer that it did. The Prater family lived in a 4-room house in a hollow on the West Virginia side of the Tug Fork that had been built in 1921 by Elmer's father, using timber cut from the ridge above the hollow and milled at a sawmill 6 miles down the county road. The house was solid. It had been built by a man who understood that the mountain winters required solidity above elegance, and 30 years of weather had confirmed his judgment without substantially diminishing the structure. The roof had been replaced twice. The porch had been repaired after a heavy snow collapse in 1936. The interior walls had been plastered, then replastered, and the floors were swept every morning by Nora Prater with a broom she had bought at the company store in 1934 and had refused to replace despite its diminished effectiveness, which was either economy or sentiment and was probably both. In 1951, Elmer and Nora occupied the main bedroom. Leonard and his wife Vivian and their 2 children occupied what had been the second bedroom and was now, through the installation of a curtain wall that Elmer had put up in 1947, technically 2 spaces rather than 1. Bobby lived 300 yards down the hollow in his own house, a smaller structure that he had built with Leonard's help in 1943 when he married. Curtis lived further up the hollow, alone, having not yet married in 1951 despite being 29 years old, which was the subject of occasional comment from Nora that Curtis received with the patience of a man who had long since accepted that his mother's curiosity about his domestic arrangements was simply a feature of the landscape he inhabited. The rhythms of life in the Prater Hollow in 1951 were the rhythms of the coal community, organized around the mine, structured by the shifts, shaped by the specific demands that underground work placed on the men who did it. Leonard and Bobby were on the day's shift, which meant they were up before 5 in the morning and at the mine by 6, and coming home at 3 in the afternoon, black-faced and hungry, ready for the meal that Vivian had prepared, and the hour of quiet that the transition from mine to home required. Curtis, working the smaller mine up the hollow, had a slightly different schedule. His shift started later and ended later, which meant he sometimes crossed paths with his brothers in the morning and sometimes didn't. Elmer was at the mine surface operation by 7 most mornings. He was home by 4. In the evenings, he sat on the porch in the warmer months and beside the stove in the colder ones, and people came to him, neighbors, family members, men from the hollow who needed advice or conversation, or simply the company of someone who had been in this place long enough to have perspective, and he gave them what he had. This was Elmer's role in the community, and it was a real role, more valued than it was explicitly acknowledged. The man who had been somewhere the longest knows things that newcomers don't, and in a hollow where most of the families had been there for generations, longest was a relative term. But Elmer Prater had earned his particular position through the combination of years and judgment and the specific quality of listening carefully before speaking, which was rarer in a hollow than it should have been. Nora Prater ran the household with the completeness that the household required. This phrase, ran the household, does not adequately convey what it meant in a 4-room house in a coal hollow in 1951. It meant grew the kitchen garden that provided vegetables from June through October and canned enough of the harvest to last through winter. It meant preserved fruit and meat in a root cellar that Elmer had dug in 1927, and that was, by 1951, its own organized system of labeled jars and careful rotation. It meant managed a small flock of chickens in the yard behind the house that provided eggs and, periodically, meat. It meant maintained the household accounts in the small ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer, tracking what came in and what went out with a precision that would have surprised people who thought that arithmetic was something you learned in school rather than something you did every day out of necessity. It meant raise the children who were in the house, her own 3 surviving sons and Leonard's 2 children, and the revolving presence of nieces and nephews and neighbors' children who came and went, in the way that the hollow required them to be raised, which is to say with the understanding that the world outside the hollow was larger and less forgiving than the world inside it, and that the way you survived the world outside was by carrying what the world inside had given you. What she gave them, above everything else, was the ability to be quiet when quiet was required. This was the most valuable thing she had to give, and she gave it completely. The Stull Hollow on the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork was different from the Prater Hollow in ways that were partly geographical and partly the accumulated result of the different histories the 2 families had brought to their respective patches of ground. The Stull house was larger, 5 rooms, built in 2 phases, the original 3-room structure from 1908 and the addition that Virgil had put up in the late 1920s when the family was growing faster than the space. It sat higher on its ridge than the Prater house, which gave a view of the hollow below and a portion of the Tug Fork visible in the distance through the trees in winter when the leaves were gone, and which also meant it caught more wind in January and required more wood to keep warm than a lower-sitting house would have. Prater-Stull's kitchen was, by the account of everyone who ate in it, the center of the Stull household in a way that went beyond the preparation of food. It was large enough for the table that seated 8 comfortably and 10 in an emergency, and in the evenings, especially in the colder months, it was a room where the family congregated, where the conversation happened, where the news of the day was exchanged and processed and converted into the family's collective understanding of what was happening and what it meant. This was Pearl's room, in the sense that it functioned as she set it up to function. She was a woman who understood that conversation was not a luxury but a necessity, that families who talked to each other were families who remained families when the pressure came, and that families who didn't were families who found, at the moment of crisis, that the architecture they thought was solid had never been properly built. She worked at keeping the conversation going. She asked questions. She drew people out. She provided the specific kind of attention that makes people feel heard, which is not the same as agreeing with them, which Pearl rarely did without thinking it through first. Virgil sat at the head of the table and allowed Pearl to run the room, which was the arrangement they had developed over 32 years, and which suited both of them. Virgil got the authority of the head position, and Pearl got the actual running of things, which was what she wanted, and which Virgil, who was not a fool, understood was the better deal for everyone. Harlan, the eldest son, was 32 in 1951. He was in some ways the most straightforward of the Stull children. Steady, reliable, not imaginative in the way that Warren was imaginative or wounded in the way that Denny was wounded, but present and consistent in a way that both his brothers depended on more than they explicitly acknowledged. He worked the mine. He came home. He was kind to his mother and respectful to his father and patient with his brothers in the specific way that eldest children in these families are patient. Not without limit, but with a longer fuse than the ones below him. He had a girlfriend in 1951, a woman named Cecilia from the next hollow, whom he would marry in 1952, and with whom he would have 4 children. He did not involve himself in the conflict with the Praters by choice. It was not that he was ignorant of it, but that he had made a deliberate decision to stay at the margins, to let Warren and his father manage it, to be available when needed, and otherwise to keep himself clear. This decision did not protect him on August 14, 1951. The men who blocked his road that night were not expecting Harlan. They were expecting Warren. The mistake, the misidentification of a truck in the dark on a county road, was the kind of mistake that conflicts make when they've been running long enough that the map of who is where is no longer reliable. Harlan survived, but he carried the lung damage from that night for the rest of his life, and he spent the remaining decades knowing that he had been hurt not for anything he had done, but for being the wrong person in the wrong truck on a night when someone else was being looked for. This knowledge had its own particular quality, distinct from the knowledge carried by the people who had been hurt for things they had actually done. He carried it quietly, which was consistent with who he was. He died in 1991 of the lung condition at the age of 72. He was buried in the Kentucky Church Cemetery with his parents, having outlived both of them and having spent 50 years in the hollow without once speaking to a Prater. Warren Stull came home from LaGrange in the spring of 1953 to a hollow that was quieter than he had left it. His father was aging visibly. Denny was present, but not present in the way that Denny was present. Harlan was married now with a child and working the mind with a specific focus on a man who has a family to feed and has decided that the family is what matters and everything else is distraction. Warren looked at what the conflict had produced, the legal records, the physical damages, the state of his brother, and he looked at it clearly, with a clarity that 14 months of thinking without interruption had given him. He had not reached a simple conclusion. He was not the kind of man who reached simple conclusions, but he had reached a conclusion that he carried forward from that spring, that the conflict had produced more cost and benefit for his family, and that pursuing it further would produce more of the same. This was not a moral conclusion. It was a practical one. The distinction matters. Warren Stull did not stop because he thought the Praters were right. He stopped because the arithmetic of continuing didn't work. But stopping, whatever the reason, was stopping. And sometimes stopping is enough. The Prater-Stull conflict, like most conflict of its kind, is documented almost entirely through the men who were its principal actors. This is a distortion of history. The women who lived alongside the conflict, who were inside the households where the decisions were made and the consequences absorbed, who managed a daily life that continued whether the men were fighting or not, who watched and worried and held things together and were never, in any official accounting, considered participants. These women experienced the conflict as completely as the men who fought it, and their experience is part of the story, even when the story doesn't know how to include it. Vivian Prater, Leonard's wife, 34 years old in 1951, had come to the Prater Hollow in 1940 when she married Leonard, from a family 3 counties over that had no connection to the Stull family and no particular stake in the history between the Praters and the Stulls. She had acquired that stake by marrying into it, which is how women in these communities historically acquired most of their conflicts, not by choice but by proximity. She had spent 11 years in the Prater Hollow by 1951. She knew the history. She knew the names. She had heard enough to understand the general shape of what had been happening between the families. Though the specific decisions made by the men were made in spaces she was not invited into and communicated to her, when communicated at all, in the indirect language of "I'm going out," and "don't wait up," and the specific quality of a man's face when he comes home from something he doesn't intend to describe. She had 2 children, a son, 8 years old in 1951, and a daughter, 5. She wanted her children to grow up without inheriting what Leonard had inherited. She said this to Leonard once only, because the once was sufficient to establish both that she had said it and that it had been received and would not be received again in the same form. Leonard said, "I'm not doing this for me, Vivian. I'm doing it for us, for what we have and what we've built, and for them to know that we don't let people take things from us." Vivian said, "And what do they know when their daddy's in prison?" Leonard didn't answer. He was in prison by 1952. His son was 9. The Stull women, Pearl and Harlan's girlfriend Cecilia, and the woman Warren would eventually marry, navigated the conflict from their particular position of proximity to decisions they hadn't been asked to make. Pearl Stull's position was the most complicated, because Pearl was the only person in either family who tried, consistently and directly and without disguising what she was doing, to interrupt the escalation. She had spoken to Virgil. She had spoken to Warren. She had looked at Denny and seen what was there, and had said, as clearly as she could say it, without crossing the line into direct opposition, that would have been refused and would have damaged the relationship she needed to maintain to have any influence at all, that the direction things were moving was bad. She had been right. She had been heard and not listened to, which is a specific experience of women in these situations, not ignored, because ignoring them would require not hearing, and the men in these families heard, but not listened to in the sense that the listening did not produce different action. Pearl Stull said many years later, to the neighbor who eventually shared these conversations with a researcher, "The hardest part wasn't watching it happen. The hardest part was being right about what was going to happen and not being able to stop it. That kind of helplessness doesn't leave you. It just changes shape over the years." She was 70 years old when she said this, And the shape it had taken by then was the shape of a woman who had made peace with her own powerlessness in the situation, while refusing to pretend the powerlessness had been comfortable. It had not been comfortable. She carried it completely. She carried it until she died. Bobby Prater's wife, a woman named Lila, was 28 years old when her husband was shot on a West Virginia road in August of 1951. She was in the house when someone came to tell her. She was in the middle of putting her children to bed. Bobby and Lila had 2 children, 4 and 2, and the knock on the door at that hour communicated everything before the words did, the way a knock at that hour always does. She went to the hospital. She sat beside Bobby's bed for 2 days before they would tell her definitely that he was going to live. The leg, they said, would not be what was. She sat beside Bobby's bed and she thought about the conversation she had been trying to have with Bobby for months. The conversation about the Stulls, about the beer joint, about the accumulation of incidents that she could see building toward something she didn't want to imagine and couldn't stop thinking about. Bobby had listened. He had said, "I know, Lila, and you're right. And don't worry in the way that men say these things when they mean to reassure, and don't know how to explain that the reassurance would require them to do things they are not able to do." She had not been reassured. She had been right not to be. And now she was sitting in a hospital room beside her husband's bed, listening to the doctor explain the complications of a broken femur, and she was holding her husband's hand, and she was doing all of this with the composure that the situation required, and that she provided completely and without hesitation, because that was what was needed, and she was the person available to provide it. She held his hand. She did not say, "I told you so." That kind of silence is not always easy. Sometimes it is the hardest kind. The coal mine was the shared context of everything in this story, and it deserves more than the background role it has been assigned so far. Both the Prater family and the Stull family were coal families. This shaped them in ways that were so fundamental that the men involved would not have been able to identify them as shaping, because they were not external influences on lives that would otherwise have been different. They were the lives themselves. The mine was not where the men went during the day. The mine was what they were. The underground work of coal mining in the Tug Fork Valley in the early 1950s was work of extraordinary physical demand conducted in conditions of extraordinary physical danger. The seams in Mingo County ran at angles and depths that required men to work in positions that human bodies were not designed for, in spaces often less than 4 feet high, in air that contained fine coal particulate that the body worked continuously and unsuccessfully to expel. The machinery, the cutting machines, the shuttle cars, the ventilation systems, was heavy and loud and required constant management and occasionally failed in ways that killed people. The safety record of the Mingo County mines in the post-war period was not good by any reasonable standard. Between 1945 and 1955, there were 11 documented fatalities in the mines where Prater and Stull family members worked. 11 deaths in 10 years, in a workforce of perhaps 500 men, which translates to a mortality rate that no contemporary workplace would tolerate. The men who worked in these conditions developed, through the working of them, a specific relationship to risk that shaped everything else about how they operated in the world. The risk of the mine was constant and real, and known and accepted. You understood, going into the mine, that the mountain above you was not reliably stable, that the air you were breathing was not good for you in ways that would become apparent over the years, that the machinery could fail, that the things that killed men in mines could kill you on any given shift without particular regard for how careful you had been. And you went in anyway, because the alternative, not going in, refusing the mine, finding something else, was not available in any practical sense for most of these men. The mine was what the valley offered. The mine was how you fed your family. The mine was where your father had worked and where your brothers worked and where the social world of men in your community was organized. You went in, and you came home at the end of the shift, and you carried, over the years, a relationship to physical danger that was neither casual nor indifferent, but that had been, through the repetition of exposure, made manageable. Not safe, manageable. You had found in yourself the ability to go into a dangerous place and do the work and come out without letting the danger consume your ability to function. This capacity, this particular kind of courage, which is not the dramatic courage of movies, but the daily, undramatic courage of people who have to function in conditions that make functioning difficult, was something both families had in abundance. It was also, unfortunately, transferable. The same capacity that allowed a man to go into a mine and do his work without being paralyzed by the danger allowed him, in a conflict with neighboring family, to take actions that a man without that capacity might have been unable to take. Not because the actions were right, they were not, but because the men taking them had, through years of mine work, developed an operational relationship to risk and consequence that made certain actions possible that would have been impossible for someone without that specific history. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation. And the distinction between those two things is, in the accounting of events like the one we are describing, essential to maintain. The UMWA, the United Mine Workers of America, had been organized in the Tug Fork Valley coalfield since the 1930s, and by 1951 the union had established contract at most of the larger operations, including the mine where Leonard and Bobby Prater worked. The contract had improved wages and had established safety committees, and had created grievance procedures that gave workers a mechanism for addressing conditions that the pre-union era had not provided. This was progress, real progress. But the union had not changed the fundamental economics of underground work. The black lung was still there, the accidents were still there, the specific toll of decades in the mine was still there. The union had made the work somewhat safer and somewhat better compensated. It had not made it safe or adequately compensated for what it took from the men who did it. The Prater men were union members. They paid their dues. They went to meetings when there were meetings. They understood the union as a fact of working life, the way they understood the mine as a fact of working life. Elmer Prater had seen the union's early organizing in the 1930s, had seen the violence that organizing had produced when the companies fought it, and had his own opinions about what it had and hadn't accomplished. He was grateful for the improvements. He was not entirely satisfied with them. This was in 1951, the assessment of most men who worked the Mingo County mines and remembered what it had been like before. They were grateful. They were not satisfied. And in the space between gratitude and satisfaction, in the gap between what had been accomplished and what still needed to be accomplished, men in these hollows lived their daily lives and raised their families and maintained their disputes with their neighbors and tried to find, in the narrow spaces available to them, something that felt like enough. Sometimes they found it. Sometimes they didn't. The Prater-Stull conflict of 1951 is one instance of a type. It is one instance, specific in its details, shaped by the specific people involved and the specific landscape they inhabited and the specific historical moment of post-war America and the coal economy and a career that sent Denny home changed in ways nobody knew how to address. But it is also a type. The type is two neighboring families in an isolated community with a long history of friction between them, a triggering incident, an escalation that both sides drove and neither fully controlled, violence that exceeded what anyone had clearly intended at the start, and a conclusion that came not from resolution, but from exhaustion and legal intervention, and the simple arithmetic of costs that had become too high to continue paying. This type has appeared in the Appalachian region continuously since the first European families settled in these mountains in the 18th century. The famous conflicts, the Hatfields and McCoys on the very same Tug Fork that runs through the story, a coincidence that is not a coincidence, but a reminder that landscapes shape the kind of things that happen in them, are the ones that made it into the history books. The Prater-Stull conflict did not make it into the history books. It made it into the sheriff's reports, into the court records, into the specific and partial documentary record that official systems keep of the things they process. And it made it into the memory of the people who were there, which is a different kind of record, more complete in some ways, less reliable in others, shaped by the perspective of the rememberer and by the years that have passed, and by what the rememberer has needed the story to mean. What distinguishes the Prater-Stull conflict from the famous versions of its type is not its violence. The violence was real but limited, and nobody died, and not its duration. It ran for about a year in its active phase, which is brief by the standards of the famous feuds. What distinguishes it, and what makes it worth telling, is its ordinariness. It was an ordinary conflict between ordinary people in an ordinary community, shaped by ordinary forces. Economic precarity, isolation, the specific damage that the mine did to men's bodies and spirits, the specific damage that Korea did to Denny Stull, the specific way that long-standing friction between neighbors becomes, in the right circumstances, a structure that pulls the people inside it in a direction they didn't entirely choose. These ordinary conflicts happened everywhere, in every decade, in every part of rural America where the conditions for them existed. Most of them were never documented. Most of them were absorbed into the community's private knowledge and left out of the official record. Most of them were managed imperfectly at real cost, but managed by the same combination of legal intervention and exhaustion and the slow cooling of time that managed this one. Most of them left marks that the people involved carried for the rest of their lives without those marks ever appearing in any document that a researcher could find. The marks were real. The carrying was real. The people were real. And that is enough reason to tell the story. There's one more thing worth saying before this account ends. The boy who was fishing on Turkey Creek Road in July of 1951. The 12-year-old who saw what happened between Warren Stull and Curtis Prater, and who, because his mother made a decision that the community would not have made, told what he'd seen to the sheriff, grew up in that valley. He knew, as he grew, what his testimony had meant in the legal proceedings that followed. He knew what it had meant for Warren Stull, who went to prison partly on the basis of what he had said. He knew what it had meant for the conflict, which had been interrupted, not resolved, but interrupted, by the entry of the legal system that his testimony had enabled. He was, by every account that exists of him, not a hero and not a villain. He was a boy who had seen something he shouldn't have had to see, who had been taken by his mother to tell what he'd seen, who had told it, and who had then lived with the knowledge of what the telling had produced. He lived in the valley. He worked. He raised a family. He did not speak, to anyone who might have passed it on, about what he'd seen or what he'd said, or what he thought about it. What he thought about it, whether he was glad or sorry, or simply accepting of something that had happened before he was old enough to make a real choice, is not known. It belongs to him. Some things do. The Tug Fork runs on, cold and narrow and matter-of-fact. Crossing the state line it has always crossed, carrying water from the mountains to the lowlands, passing to the valley where the Praters and the Stulls lived out their conflict in the ordinary, extraordinary way of people who have no other choice. The river doesn't know what happened on its banks. The river just runs. It will be running long after the last person who remembers any of these names has gone. That is the nature of rivers. That is the nature things.